A gate agent laughed after slamming the door on a black CEO's son, but what the CEO did next made the entire terminal fall silent. She thought shutting a door on a child would end the argument. She didn't realize the man watching was the boy's father, and the door she slammed would soon open to consequences. Subscribe if you believe cruelty always meets its reflection. The gate door slammed forward. With a jarring metallic thud, it struck Milo Ellen's shoulder, the impact echoing through the terminal like a dropped weight in a silent chapel. The boy staggered backward, his small frame recoiling instinctively as pain bloomed across his collarbone. He let out a sharp, breathless gasp, more shock than scream, and clutched at the spot with wide, disoriented eyes. The hum of boarding announcements and distant coffee machines faded as travelers nearby turned toward the source of the noise. Darren Krell, the gate agent standing tall behind the counter, didn't flinch. He simply chuckled, low and condescending, with one corner of his mouth curled in amusement. "Guess he's not ready to fly yet," he muttered without looking at anyone in particular, as if the violence he'd just inflicted was no more serious than a paper jam. For a moment, Cyrus Ellen didn't move. He had been just a step behind his son, guiding Milo toward the jet bridge, his briefcase still looped over his shoulder. His expression, which had been calm and focused moments ago, transformed in stages: puzzlement, recognition, alarm, and then settled into something altogether colder. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he stepped forward and knelt beside his son, his hand gently bracing Milo's back, checking him wordlessly. His other hand hovered over the injured shoulder, feeling for signs of a break. The boy's eyes were wet, but he didn't cry. His mouth trembled slightly, but he bit down on it. "I'm okay," Milo whispered, though his voice cracked. "I think I'm okay." "You're not," Cyrus replied quietly, steadying the boy with a firm arm. His voice was deep and even, like a piano note pressed and held too long. "You were hurt." Around them, the silence deepened. Travelers watched, some with hesitation, others with phones halfway raised. No one intervened yet, but the tension in the air was unmistakable, the kind of hush that settled before a storm. Cyrus stood slowly. He turned to face Darren, who had leaned casually against the counter, arms folded, utterly unconcerned. His posture was lazy, but his eyes held something flinty, mocking, perhaps even daring. He didn't apologize, didn't ask if the boy was all right. He just waited, like someone who'd done this before and never been challenged. Cyrus took a single step forward. His gaze didn't harden. It became still, unmoving, like the surface of black ice. "That gate has a lock," he said, his voice just above a whisper. "A safety stop. You manually released it." Darren shrugged. "It slipped." "These things happen." "You aimed it," Cyrus replied, no louder than before, directly at him. A flicker passed across Darren's face, but it was gone before it formed into guilt. "You saw what you wanted to see, sir." He shouldn't have been walking so fast. "It's just a minor bump. Kids are—" The word died in his throat as Cyrus stepped closer, now inches from the counter. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He didn't need to. "You'll regret that," he said softly. The air shifted. Even Darren's smirk faltered for a second. One of the nearby attendants, a young man in a navy vest, shifted awkwardly behind the podium, eyes darting between the two men. He looked as if he wanted to speak but wasn't sure what to say. Another employee glanced toward the security phone but didn't reach for it. Cyrus didn't notice them. Or rather, he noticed everything, but didn't acknowledge them yet. His focus was entirely on Darren, on the way his fingers casually tapped the desk, on the smug lift of his eyebrow, on the casual disregard he wore like a badge. "What did you say?" Darren asked finally, but the false bravado in his voice cracked at the edges. Cyrus's reply was calm, unhurried. It was the laugh that crossed the line. The thud of the gate door echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous terminal. Gasps rippled through the crowd near Gate 47B as Milo stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. Cyrus was on one knee before the boy even hit the ground, his briefcase thudding softly beside him. He gently pulled Milo's jacket aside, examining the way the boy held his arm, rigid, with pain blooming in the socket. Cyrus's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Breathe, Milo. Let me see." The boy's face was pale, not from tears but from sheer confusion. He hadn't expected to be struck, least of all by someone meant to ensure passengers' safety. His shoulder already bore the red hue of blunt trauma, and his lips trembled, not from pain alone, but from humiliation. Travelers nearby had frozen, unsure whether to help or stay uninvolved. Standing just feet away, Darren Krell crossed his arms, weight shifted arrogantly to one hip. "He'll be fine," he said with a shrug, his voice thick with indifference. "Door must have bounced weird." Cyrus rose slowly, eyes never leaving Darren. The gate agent's stance was relaxed, too casual. His smirk hadn't faded. The terminal resumed its quiet hum, but it was now punctuated by murmurs, soft voices whispering between passengers. A businessman with a briefcase whispered to another, "That wasn't an accident." I saw his hand on the latch. Security officers appeared minutes too late, summoned only by distant calls to the terminal's operations desk. Their posture suggested routine, a report, a misunderstanding, nothing urgent. One of them, Officer Lannard, a broad-shouldered man with thinning blonde hair, approached with a clipboard and a neutral tone. "We heard there was a minor incident." Cyrus gestured toward Milo, who was seated now on the bench near the window, arm cradled gently across his chest. "He was struck by the gate door," Cyrus said evenly. "Intentionally." Darren scoffed behind them. "The thing slipped." "Happens all the time," Lannard looked between them, unsure who to believe. "Was anyone injured?" "He needs medical attention," Cyrus replied firmly. "I've already requested paramedics." They haven't arrived. Another officer radioed in a call, receiving only static at first. "They're tied up on another case," he muttered. "Might be a few more minutes." Cyrus didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his phone. He raised it, calmly pressing record. The red light blinked on as the lens focused on Darren, who hadn't moved from his smug stance behind the counter. "Would you like to repeat your statement?" Cyrus asked. Darren blinked, then smirked as if enjoying the attention. "Accidents happen, sir," he said with mock politeness. "Maybe you shouldn't let kids run ahead." Milo flinched at the jab. He hadn't run. He'd been walking beside his father the whole time. Cyrus turned the camera slowly to his son, capturing the bruised shoulder and quiet confusion etched into the boy's features. Then he spoke, voice low but deliberate. "An accident repeats when no one learns from it." A few passengers nearby heard the statement and exchanged looks. One of them, an older man in a navy sweater, stepped forward. "I saw what happened," he said, addressing Officer Lannard. "The agent let the door go on purpose." He waited, smiled, and dropped it. Another voice followed, this time a younger man, barely out of college. "Same. It didn't slip. He shoved it." Cyrus didn't react outwardly, but a calculation settled behind his eyes. He knew the gate mechanism. Years ago, before taking over Lumeris Dynamics, he'd been an engineer specializing in pressure-assisted fixtures, exactly like the ones used on boarding gates. The latch on these doors required a conscious lift to release, and a specific angle of force to swing. Darren hadn't slipped, he'd aimed. The officers took the statements half-heartedly, noting details on the clipboard, but not acting. Cyrus could feel it, the institutional shrug creeping in, the casual dismissal that cloaked corporate environments when employees slipped up in uniform. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply reached for his briefcase, clicked it open, and discreetly activated the small button near the clasp. A hidden recording device blinked to life, part of a prototype his company was testing for secure business travel. Everything said from now on would be documented. Officer Leonard turned back. "Sir, we'll file a report and advise the airline to follow up. In the meantime, it's best to proceed with boarding." Cyrus turned fully toward him, voice now edged with steel. "We won't be boarding until my son receives medical care. Until that happens, I suggest someone escalate this beyond a clipboard." The second officer shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, please don't escalate the situation." "I'm not escalating," Cyrus replied, stepping closer, his tone unwavering. "I'm observing. I've asked for help, been denied medical aid, and witnessed an agent smirk after striking a child. If you interpret calm documentation as escalation, you may want to review your response protocols." Tension thickened. Milo looked on, blinking back the discomfort swelling in his shoulder. The boy leaned toward the glass window, his reflection blurred by sunlight. He whispered faintly, "Dad, maybe let it go." But Cyrus's eyes never left Darren. "I can't let it go," he said, softer now, "because if I do, the next father might be forced to carry his son off this floor, not walk beside him." Another 10 minutes passed. No paramedics arrived. The airline's crew remained stone-faced behind the counter. Darren leaned on the desk like he was untouchable. Cyrus slowly stepped back, scanning the terminal. One camera above the boarding corridor pointed directly at Gate 47B. He made note of its angle, its range, and its timestamp. Evidence was everywhere, hidden in silence, buried in routine, waiting to be noticed. And he would notice. The officer tried once more. "Sir, this is going on too long. If we don't move forward, we'll need to remove you from the area." Cyrus didn't blink. "Then remove me. But every second you delay, every excuse you offer, is being recorded, not just here," he raised the phone again, "but in systems I helped design." The officer hesitated. Darren chuckled again. That laugh, low, dismissive, almost bored, cut through Cyrus like a blade far deeper than anger. And that's when it settled. Not the rage, not the grief, the precision. He had his variables now. The angle of the door, the time code of the strike, the witnesses, the smirk, the medical delay, the laughter, each one a piece of the equation, and equations, he knew, always ended in one place. The truth, and he would calculate it down to the decimal. Cyrus lowered his phone. The light still blinked. He turned once more to Milo and crouched beside him. The boy leaned his head on his father's shoulder, tired but comforted by the steady calm of the man beside him. Cyrus placed a hand gently on his back and looked toward the counter one final time. When truth is built like an equation, no lie can survive its sum. The apology arrived late and empty. Joran Vale stepped into the tension-thickened terminal with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His navy blue blazer bore the subtle insignia of Bravian Airways' corporate division, and he clutched a slim leather folio like a shield. Passengers parted silently as he approached, sensing this was more than a delayed flight. Cyrus Ellen stood motionless near the counter, his frame calm but composed like a man measuring a storm inside a bottle. Beside him, Milo sat slumped in a waiting chair, his arm held gingerly across his chest, pale but quiet. The boy hadn't spoken in several minutes. "Dr. Ellen, I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience," Joran began, his voice coated in syrup but edged with condescension. "We'd like to offer compensation for the delay and distress. Travel vouchers, full fare refund. You'll fix what your staff broke first," Cyrus interrupted, his tone firm but without raised volume. It landed harder than any shout. His eyes didn't move from Joran's face, unblinking, unreadable. Joran blinked, thrown off rhythm. Of course, we just want to make this right." But it wasn't right. Not with Darren Krell leaning against the wall behind the desk, arms folded, mouth twisted into a half-smile as if none of this mattered. That same laugh, low, casual, cruel, escaped him again. It was a sound that didn't belong in the sterile, humming space of an airport terminal. It belonged in a darker place. "Guess everyone's a victim these days," Darren muttered loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. A few turned away, embarrassed. Others began recording again. Milo stirred. "Dad, let's just go," he whispered, barely audible. Cyrus's head turned just slightly. He looked at his son and gave the faintest shake of his head. No anger, no drama, just intent. "This is not about going, Milo," he said softly. "It's about what happens if we do." Then to Joran, "I want access to the terminal's internal security footage." Now Joran blinked again, confused. I don't believe that's within standard passenger rights." "I'm invoking Clause 4.7 of the Aviation Passenger Ethics Act," Cyrus said evenly, pulling a folded paper from his inner jacket pocket. "In cases of alleged physical misconduct by staff, passengers are permitted to request non-destructive footage review with reasonable justification." Joran glanced at the document as if it were a relic from a language he didn't speak. "This isn't standard." "I helped write that clause," Cyrus added, his voice low, almost apologetic. 4 years ago. You can look it up." Darren laughed again, louder this time. "You're really dragging this out over a kid bumping his shoulder on a door?" The stillness that followed felt like the terminal itself had inhaled. Cyrus turned slowly, pulled his briefcase to his side, and pressed a discreet panel on the clasp. A light blinked once, then faded. Inside, a recorder, disguised as a magnetized seam tool, clicked silently into action. "What's your full name, Mr. Krell?" Cyrus asked suddenly, his tone neutral. "Why?" "Because you just repeated a version of the event that contradicts at least 3 witnesses." "You're now being recorded for accuracy," Joran stepped in quickly. "Sir, we don't permit unauthorized recordings." "I'm not on your property," Cyrus said calmly. "Not yet. This is a public terminal, and I'm documenting misconduct in the interest of safety and ethics, which the Ethics Act also allows under Clause 6.2. He turned the briefcase slightly, angling the hidden lens toward Darren's amused face. "Say it again," Cyrus said. "What you just said about the bump." Darren's grin faltered. From behind them, a security officer approached, hesitant. "Is there a problem here?" Cyrus responded before Joran could intercept. "Yes. A deliberate act caused physical injury to a minor, followed by negligence in medical response and attempted denial of evidence. I've requested access to camera footage and have been denied. I've begun recording interactions under applicable aviation statutes." The officer looked at Joran, then at Darren, then down at the seated boy holding his shoulder. "We've got cameras," he said quietly. "If there's injury involved, it's not unreasonable." "I'd prefer to have it reviewed immediately," Cyrus added, "before footage is overwritten or misplaced." Joran shifted uncomfortably. "There's a process." "Then initiate it," Cyrus said. The silence that followed wasn't hollow, it was sharp. It was the silence of shifting lines, of power beginning to slip from where it was assumed to belong. Behind Cyrus's composed exterior, the engineer in him had already calculated the pressure needed to release a safety latch, the weight of the door at that angle, the time delay between impact and Darren's smug laughter. He didn't need anger to build his case. He needed patterns. He needed proof. He turned to the officer. "Could I get a timestamp of the incident from your internal system?" "I'll check what I can," the officer nodded, retreating. Joran cleared his throat again. "We really can resolve this, Dr. Ellen. I'm sure." "Are you?" Cyrus asked, not looking at him. His hand hovered briefly over the briefcase. Then he adjusted his cuff. "I'd suggest you remember this moment, Mr. Vale, because everything said here today is going to be examined." Joran said nothing. Cyrus gave a final glance toward Darren, who now looked slightly less amused. Behind every smirk, Cyrus thought, there's often a man who thinks he's untouchable. But arrogance forgets that the law isn't emotion, it's architecture, and I build things that last. He stepped back beside Milo, placing a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Rest," he said to him. "This isn't your burden." Cyrus didn't look back as the gate agent turned his gaze away for the first time. Behind that still expression, gears turned. Every word spoken now would become evidence later. The law begins where arrogance assumes it ends. The wait dragged like molasses, thick with tension and unanswered questions. Cyrus stood beside his son, Milo, who sat hunched near the window, cradling his bruised arm with quiet endurance. His sneakers barely touched the tiled floor as he shifted occasionally, wincing with each movement. A faint reflection of sunlight from the terminal's high glass panels glinted off his skin, tracing a line from his temple to his jaw. The boy didn't cry. He never had, not even at the moment of impact, but his silence said more than 100 screams could. Nearby, passengers watched from behind phone screens and hushed curiosity, as though unsure whether they were witnessing a delay or the start of something deeper. It took 3 more calls before the paramedics finally arrived. 2 men in navy jackets with clipped ID badges, both looking apologetic but rushed, crouched beside Milo and asked him to describe the pain. One gently rotated the shoulder while the other checked for nerve response. "Dislocation," one muttered, glancing at Cyrus. "Possibly some minor tearing. He'll need a sling and monitoring." Cyrus nodded, expression unreadable, then bent down to thank them. The kindness in his voice was real, but chilled. It wasn't the medics who had failed his son. Straightening, Cyrus turned slowly toward the gate desk. Darren Krell leaned against the counter, arms crossed in theatrical boredom. The man looked as if he belonged in control, but his stance reeked of someone bluffing through a storm he hadn't expected. The supervisor, a younger man with wide eyes and a badge that read Brenton Vale, stepped forward, attempting diplomacy. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but this situation is escalating. If you continue creating a scene, we may be forced to—" Cyrus raised one hand gently, his voice calm but firm enough to quiet the space. "You think this is a scene?" His eyes never blinked as he locked onto Brenton's. "I'm just setting the stage." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out Milo's boarding pass. The blue and white cardstock glimmered faintly in the overhead light. With deliberate precision, he laid it down on the desk, perfectly aligned with the small red light of the security camera embedded above the counter. The angle was intentional. Everything from here on out would be recorded, not by accident, but by design. Darren's smirk faltered. Cyrus's next movement was slow, measured. His right hand slid toward the metal gate lever, the same one Darren had slammed earlier without warning. A hush settled over the terminal. A pair of airline crew members took an unconscious step back. Brenton stiffened. Cyrus gripped the lever with surgical control and lifted it halfway. The gate began to pivot with a quiet creak of pressure. Its edge hovered just inches from Darren's hip, poised but unmoving. Then, with a crisp flick of the wrist, he halted it. The motion had been swift, controlled, exact. Darren flinched. "That's the exact force you used," Cyrus said, his voice barely louder than a whisper, but it carried across the silence like a bell tolling in an empty room. He let the lever fall slowly, the metal clanking back into its socket like a final note in a symphony of restraint. There was no chaos, no threat, just physics and memory, replayed with clean lines and colder purpose. Cyrus turned his body slightly, half facing the stunned crew, half toward the security camera that continued its quiet vigil above. His expression was unreadable, a blend of disappointment and intent. Then he spoke again, softer this time, but no less cutting. "Imagine it twice." The moment crystallized. Around them, no one moved. No phones clicked. No announcements cut through the silence. Even the low hum of the airport seemed to mute itself in the presence of a man who had just demonstrated the raw edge of justice without ever crossing the line. His final words, weightless in volume but thunderous in implication, echoed quietly across the terminal. Every action has a mirror. It just waits for the right reflection. Later that afternoon, after 2 uniformed security officers tried and failed to quietly escort Dr. Cyrus Ellen away from the gate area, he calmly requested a private meeting. The request wasn't a plea. It was a controlled condition. He would not be moved, not until a meeting was granted. When the lounge doors closed behind him, the noise of the airport faded, leaving only the cold hum of air conditioning and the quiet tension that stretched like piano wire across the room. Darren Krell was already inside, slouched in a leather chair with an air of bored defiance. He spun a pen between his fingers as if nothing that had occurred earlier was of any consequence. His uniform jacket was unzipped, and his expression bordered on amused. Cyrus entered without a word, setting a charcoal-gray folder on the polished table between them. The words Lumeris Compliance Division were embossed in silver across the front, catching the light from the overhead fixtures. He didn't sit yet. He simply opened the folder and let its contents speak first. Darren glanced at the documents, diagrams of the gate's internal mechanism, side-by-side frame captures from surveillance footage, annotated stills of Milo's injury, and a printout of the Aviation Passenger Ethics Act. "You really want to risk your image over a bump?" Darren finally asked, his voice casual, but his eyes flicking uneasily across the growing pile of evidence. Cyrus met his gaze and slowly took the opposite seat, folding his hands. His voice was low, even. "I'm not risking it. I'm defining it." There was no anger in his tone, just resolve, sharp and undeniable. From the side pocket of the folder, he pulled out a slim, red-labeled USB drive and placed it on the table with quiet finality. "This footage has already been transmitted to 3 legal teams and 1 journalist," he said. "The kind who doesn't chase stories, he waits for them to find him. He owes me a favor." The air shifted. Darren leaned forward, the cocky posture beginning to fade. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. His fingers gripped the armrest now, no longer twirling the pen. Cyrus didn't blink. "What I find interesting," he said, tapping the top diagram, "is that the latch you claimed slipped was manually released. I helped design the early prototypes of these gates. The pressure-resistance ratio, the reverse lock curve, it doesn't fail like that." Darren's lips parted slightly, then closed again. The silence between them thickened. Cyrus leaned forward, reducing the space and increasing the weight of his words. "You'll apologize to my son," he said, publicly. "Or the world will see how you laughed while he screamed." There it was. No raised voice, no dramatics. Just the unshakable calm of a man who had been underestimated too many times and had learned the power of silence as a scalpel. "You wouldn't," Darren muttered, his voice barely audible now. Cyrus stood slowly, collected the USB, and returned it to the folder. His eyes lingered on Darren, not with hatred, but with something colder. Clarity. "You're right," he said, walking to the door. "I wouldn't laugh." Outside the lounge, the terminal buzzed with low conversation and the occasional echo of distant announcements. Passengers moved like currents in a river, unaware that a tide had just shifted behind the lounge door. Milo stood nearby, his bandaged shoulder resting gently in a sling, his eyes scanning his father's face as he emerged. Cyrus gave him a nod, not of conclusion, but of continuity. He placed a hand on Milo's back, guiding him toward the row of seats near the window. The boy said nothing, but he didn't have to. He had seen the way his father moved, not with anger, but with certainty, with purpose. And even though the confrontation had passed, the consequences had not. They were just beginning to unfold. Behind them, Darren remained in the lounge, unmoving, his confidence cracked by something far more dangerous than rage, a quiet man with proof. Outside, the clouds began to thin, and sunlight pooled across the tile floor. Somewhere in that light, a reckoning had begun. The apology would come, but so would the reckoning. The clip was only 13 seconds long, but it was enough. That evening, as dusk settled over the city, the short video began circulating on travel blogs and social platforms. A passenger who had discreetly recorded the moment when the gate door slammed into Milo's shoulder had uploaded it under the title, CEO Confronts Gate Agent After Son Injured. The angle was slightly tilted, but the audio was clear. The sound of Darren's laughter rang out in crisp clarity, followed by the thud of impact and a stunned gasp from Milo. Within hours, reposts surged across platforms. Comments ranged from sympathy to outrage, sparking a debate that outgrew the airport and entered the national conversation. Yet, as the story spread like wildfire, the man at its center sat in silence. Cyrus Ellen remained in the hospital waiting room, hands folded, back straight, his phone buzzing nonstop beside him. His PR team had sent 3 messages in red font. "We advise immediate statement." He read each one but replied to none. Instead, he tapped a contact labeled R. Voss and waited as the call connected. Dr. Raylan Voss picked up on the second ring. His voice was quiet but sharp. "I've seen it." "Then you know why I called," Cyrus said, rising from the chair, his eyes tracing the hallway where Milo lay resting. "I don't want emotion. I want foundation." "I assume we're talking full review?" Raylan asked. "Frame by frame." Within the hour, Raylan arrived at the hospital with a slim black laptop and a pair of noise-canceling headphones. They settled into a quiet consultation room. The light flickered slightly above them, the hum of distant machinery faint in the background. On the screen, the footage played in slow motion. Every pixel was examined. Every flicker of Darren's hand, the angle of the door, the brief moment just before the impact. Cyrus didn't flinch watching it, but his jaw tightened incrementally with each pass. "There," Raylan said, freezing the frame. "Watch the pinky." Cyrus leaned in. The latch mechanism had a manual override, a small lever tucked into the underside of the frame. It wasn't possible to disengage it accidentally unless pressure was applied at a specific point. In the freeze frame, Darren's little finger curled inward, exactly at that position. "It was deliberate," Cyrus said. "Not a question, a confirmation." "Proof of intent," Raylan replied, his eyes narrowing. "That's not just misconduct. That's targeted harm." Cyrus sat back slowly, exhaling through his nose. The silence in the room thickened. "Milo thinks I'm not angry," he said after a pause. Raylan glanced at him. "And are you?" "I was. For one moment." When he gasped, Cyrus's voice was low. "But anger evaporates." "Precision doesn't." The door creaked as a nurse passed outside, reminding them of where they were. Cyrus stood and walked to the window. Below, the city moved in small patterns, cars inching through lights, people passing without knowing they were steps away from the epicenter of something larger. "He used that door to humiliate a child," Cyrus murmured. "I won't use fists." "I'll use the door." Raylan nodded slowly, understanding the undercurrent of what Cyrus meant. Symbolic response. Exact replication. Legal. Documented. Public Milo stirred awake in the adjacent room, his bandaged arm resting on his chest. Cyrus entered quietly, the edge of his expression softening. The boy blinked sleepily, then looked up with the same question he had been holding since the incident. "Dad, you're not mad, are you?" Cyrus crouched beside him and placed a gentle hand over his son's uninjured arm. His voice was soft but unwavering. "Madness burns quickly, son. Justice holds the flame steady." He waited for Milo to nod, then kissed his forehead and stepped back out. Behind his calm exterior, his strategy was already unfolding. Legal notices, mechanical reconstructions, waiver preparations. But it wouldn't be enough to punish. It had to reflect. In another room, Raylan was already drafting the motion needed to secure approval for a public demonstration at the terminal. The tone would be factual, the language airtight. No violence, no spectacle, just clarity, just replication. Cyrus returned to the window one final time, the glow of the city lights illuminating half his face. When someone uses a door to humiliate, that same door becomes their judgment. "That's one," said Cyrus Ellen, his voice steady, calm, deadly in its composure. Passengers nearby froze mid-step. Conversations tapered into silence. The terminal, a place usually buzzing with background noise and travel chatter, now held its breath. The gate door still vibrated faintly from the force of its sudden movement, the tremor echoing the thrum of rising tension. Darren's strained grin had vanished, replaced with the pale realization that something irreversible had just begun. Cyrus didn't blink. He stood centered before Gate 47B in a charcoal gray coat, sleeves tailored precisely to his wrists, shoulders squared like a man giving a keynote address. Only this wasn't a stage. It was a courtroom made of glass, steel, and memory. In his right hand, he held two small polished rods glinting under the overhead lights, replicas of the hinge mechanism from the gate door that had struck his son. They weren't just props, they were proof. A few feet away, the terminal manager hovered beside a legal advisor, both visibly unsure whether to intervene. The waiver had been signed, Section 12 of the Aviation Ethics Regulation, clear as day. Cyrus was within his rights to demonstrate the mechanical threshold for force in a passenger injury dispute. It was rare, but the clause had existed for years. Most airlines avoided it like a lawsuit. But Cyrus wasn't most passengers. He was the man who'd helped draft that regulation a decade ago. Cyrus slowly stepped forward again, one hand on the gate's handle. Darren's back stiffened. The tension between them pulsed like electricity stretched taut. A cameraman from a local travel network edged closer, lens aimed and focused. Reporters gathered beyond the checkpoint, alerted by a discreet press advisory sent that morning. The CEO's internal compliance team had planned this moment down to the minute. "Observe," Cyrus said, addressing no one in particular. His voice carried with the cadence of a professor in lecture. "The hinge has a lock point here," he tapped the mechanism, "designed to prevent accidental force beyond 5 newtons. To override it, you must manually release this catch." He demonstrated it with clinical precision, his fingers steady, measured. "That's what Mr. Krell did, intentionally, which is why my son's shoulder dislocated upon impact." Gasps flickered through the crowd. Some passengers recorded on their phones. Others simply stared, eyes wide. Darren tried to speak, tried to scoff, to dismiss it with another smirk, but the air had shifted. There was no laughter now, only dread. "Mr. Krell," Cyrus said softly, turning his head just enough to meet his eyes, "you've denied intent. Claimed accident. But let me show you the weight of what you called a slip." In one fluid motion, Cyrus raised the lever again. This time, his body turned slightly, and with a calculated swing, sharp but controlled, he drove the gate forward. It didn't strike Darren, but it came so close that the wind of its passing tugged at his jacket. "That's one." Darren took a step back involuntarily, shoulders drawn tight, pupils dilating. His breath quickened, but he said nothing. He wasn't sure he could. Cyrus paused. Time seemed to stretch as his eyes locked on the agent, studying him like an engineer studying stress on a steel beam. He repeated the action, this time harder. The metal gate whooshed forward again, deliberate, clean, and the edge of it grazed the hem of Darren's uniform belt. The vibration passed like a shiver through his lower back. Another half-inch and the impact would have been real, but it wasn't about pain. It was about echo. "That's 2, Cyrus whispered. The hush inside the terminal was complete. A child nearby whispered to his father. A man in a suit set down his coffee. Somewhere, an intercom clicked on and off again, whoever held the mic, too, stunned to speak. Darren's face had drained of all color. He was no longer the smirking agent from yesterday, no longer protected by routine or uniform. In that moment, stripped of authority, he looked like what he was, a man who'd used his power to harm a child, and now stood face to face with a reckoning not of fists, but of design. Cyrus let the gate rest slowly back into place, the hinge releasing with a soft, final click. He turned his face slightly, eyes scanning the onlookers, then shifting to the cameras, ensuring the moment had been captured. But there was no vanity in his gaze, only finality. He stepped back without another word, the two replica rods now held at his side like gavel and torch. Then he spoke to Darren one last time, each syllable carved with quiet intent. "You laughed at pain. I taught you its echo." She mocked the family as the door hit the boy's shoulder, laughing while others looked away. If you believe power without empathy destroys itself, hit subscribe now, because silence only protects the cruel. Security rushed in, boots striking the polished terminal floor with precision as two uniformed officers broke through the circle of stunned passengers. But before they could reach the gate counter, Cyrus Ellen raised his right hand, his expression calm and resolute. "Not assault," he said, voice steady but loud enough to halt their momentum. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a single sheet of folded paper. "Documentation." The officers paused, exchanging a quick glance before one of them took the paper and scanned it. The clause was clear. Under Section 12 of the Aviation Ethics Regulation, Cyrus had lawfully submitted and received consent for a mechanical demonstration replicating the original injury. A corporate seal from the airline's own legal department was stamped across the bottom. Cyrus stepped back from the gate, his posture measured, composed. Darren Krell stood frozen near the boarding threshold, red-faced, breath shallow. He looked to the other staff for support, but none of them moved. Not one crew member stepped forward. Several averted their eyes. The quiet murmurs from the crowd rose, passengers whispering, nodding, murmuring approval. A few clapped softly. It wasn't violence. It was precision. The same motion, the same door, but this time under the eye of law, with deliberate control. And the symmetry of it, the echo of the original act, was more powerful than retaliation. It was reconstruction. Milo stood a few steps behind, his arms still in a sling, his gaze fixed on his father. His mouth hung slightly open, unsure whether to be proud or afraid. The air shimmered with tension, not from chaos, but consequence. Cyrus turned toward his son, eyes softening for just a moment. He knelt slightly and spoke quietly enough that only Milo and the nearest few could hear. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the formula." He stood again as the airline's senior legal representative, a man in a slate-blue suit named Garen Morn, approached briskly from the side, flanked by two corporate escorts. He motioned toward a side hallway. "Mr. Ellen, we'd like to speak with you privately to resolve this amicably." Cyrus nodded once. "Very well. Let's speak where honesty doesn't echo." The private room was quiet, windowless, and cool. A table sat in the center, empty except for a notepad and 2 water bottles. Garen gestured to a seat. Cyrus remained standing, placing a small folder on the table instead. "We'll begin with what I'm not here for," Cyrus said. "I'm not seeking monetary compensation. I'm not filing a civil injury suit. I am, however, demanding institutional repair." Garen blinked. "Institutional?" "Your employee didn't act alone," Cyrus continued. "He was protected. He delayed medical assistance. He laughed at a child's pain. And now, because you allowed that kind of power to go unchecked, you face not just a scandal, but precedent." Garen opened his mouth to respond, but Cyrus raised a hand slightly. "I want 3 things. First, a formal disciplinary review board established under an independent ethics consultant. Second, real-time transparency into employee conduct complaints, anonymized but logged. And third, a recorded apology from Mr. Krell, submitted to the Aviation Oversight Registry. Garin hesitated, hands folded tightly. "This kind of exposure is already happening," Cyrus interrupted. "Check your news alerts." The demonstration footage has already surfaced. 3 clips. The headline reads, "CEO executes lawful demonstration after gate assault." "And the comment section," he added, "isn't kind." Garin sighed deeply, the practiced neutrality in his expression beginning to crack. "We'll need time." "You have 48 hours, Cyrus replied. "After that, my compliance team opens a public archive of the full footage, unedited, and we reveal your past handling of similar incidents." Garin's eyes narrowed. "What similar?" "You'll want to review Mr. Krell's personnel file," Cyrus said, already stepping toward the door. "Your HR team buried 6 misconduct warnings over 3 years. It's not just about Milo anymore." Back in the terminal, Darren Krell slumped behind the counter, his posture defeated. He stared down at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Around him, silence replaced mockery. Authority had returned to its rightful place, not above justice, but beneath it. Cyrus approached Milo, resting a hand lightly on his back. "Ready?" he asked. Milo nodded, still processing everything. "I think so." Together they moved toward the lounge. Behind them, the terminal slowly returned to normal. But something had shifted. A line had been drawn, quiet, sharp, and unmistakable. Back inside the HR database, names began to surface. Reports, once dismissed, now reopened. What had seemed like a single man's cruelty was unraveling into a pattern. And all of it, every investigation, traced back to the same moment. The laughter, the door, the silence that followed. The truth doesn't rise by accident. It's pushed upward by consequence. Cyrus stared at the screen in his home office, the room dim except for the glow of the security footage. The file had arrived anonymously just minutes ago, an encrypted package routed through multiple servers. He decrypted it cautiously, expecting a dead lead. Instead, what he saw made his jaw tighten. The footage wasn't from the main terminal. It was internal, time-stamped security logs from the airline's private communications server. The video showed Darren Krell moments after the gate incident, pacing in the back office while holding his radio close. The audio was grainy but intact. "Braun, I need cover. He's not letting it go." Darren's voice crackled through the static. Then came the reply, calm and deliberate. "Say it slipped." "I'll log it under mechanical mishap. We delete the footage after 24. You're shielded. Do not engage further." Cyrus paused the footage and leaned back slowly. So this wasn't just arrogance, it was protocol. Braun Cade, senior operations chief, had stepped in less than 5 minutes after the incident to bury it. The cover-up wasn't just impulsive, it was rehearsed. For a brief moment, Cyrus felt the weight of what this meant. It wasn't just about Milo anymore. It was about every parent, every passenger who had been silenced by a shrug and a smile. The rot ran deeper than one gate agent's cruelty, and if Braun was willing to falsify a report this quickly, who else had suffered invisibly? He tapped his fingers on the desk in steady rhythm, his mind moving faster than his body. Then, without a word, he opened a new file titled Internal Motion, Ethics Audit Request, Level 2. He listed Darren Krell as the originating employee, followed by Braun Cade as supervisory accomplice. He expanded the list to include all regional operations managers who had access to surveillance override. It was a network, and he was done playing nice. 3 clicks later, the motion was submitted to the Aviation Oversight Division. It was official now. A procedural fire had been lit. The ripple would begin. Minutes later, as if on cue, his phone vibrated. Unknown number. He answered, saying nothing. "You're making enemies you can't afford," a low voice growled. Broncade didn't bother with introductions. His tone was flat, but the anger beneath it was unmistakable. Cyrus didn't flinch. "I've survived worse than cowards who hide behind uniforms," he said, his voice like steel under velvet. A tense silence followed. Then the line went dead. Cyrus stared at the receiver, lips pressed tight. There it was, the threat, the validation. He stood and walked to the window, watching distant headlights flicker across the city's veins. In the reflection, he saw a man no longer content to respond. He was initiating now. Down the hallway, Milo's room was dim. The door cracked open. Cyrus stepped in and saw his son asleep, his arms still bandaged, resting on a pillow. But something had changed. Next to the bed sat a sheet of exercise instructions from the therapist, marked in pencil. Lines of determination, not obligation. Beneath that paper was a hand-drawn sketch. A boarding gate with a broken door and a figure standing in front of it, arms raised, not in surrender, but in defiance. The sight stirred something in Cyrus. The boy wasn't just healing, he was rising. The next day, Cyrus walked alongside Milo into a physical therapy clinic tucked between downtown towers. The receptionist nodded in quiet recognition. News had traveled fast. Inside, Milo stood in front of a balance bar, his injured arm trembling as he gripped the handle. "I want to try the full lift today," Milo said to the therapist, a man named Rehan who blinked in surprise. Cyrus watched from the bench, silent, fists clasped under his chin. Every inch Milo pushed was another inch reclaimed. Reporters had begun referring to him as the boy who stood again. Cyrus knew media could be a double-edged sword, but he also saw how Milo's recovery resonated. This was no longer just about legal retribution. This was about showing the world that recovery was rebellion. That night, Cyrus sat down with his legal advisor, a precise man named Jalon Tren. Together, they reviewed the full list of personnel tied to surveillance access. Jalon raised an eyebrow as he spotted overlapping incidents. "This isn't the first time, Cyrus," Jalon said grimly. "False logs. Delayed paramedics. There's a pattern." Cyrus leaned forward. "Then we don't stop at Darren." We named the entire chain. As Jalon began filing the broader motion, Cyrus opened a document titled Statement of Public Trust. It wasn't meant for a press release. It was a blueprint for a future where gate counters couldn't become walls and laughter at pain had consequences. But even as hope flickered in the strategy room, Cyrus knew this path came with risk. The airline would strike back, perhaps not openly but subtly, using policy, PR, even intimidation. Still, he welcomed it. Truth only grew sharper under pressure. The next morning, as they stepped out of the therapy clinic, a group of passers-by recognized them. One man gave a quiet nod. Another clapped once and walked on. Milo looked up, confused. "Why are they looking at us like that?" Cyrus paused. "Because sometimes, son, people look at the person who stands and forget who helped him rise." Milo frowned thoughtfully, then smiled just a little. "Then I'll keep standing." Cyrus looked forward, the city ahead, the courtroom soon to come, the truth inching toward daylight. He could already sense the resistance forming, but he wasn't walking into it alone anymore. The boy beside him was no longer just recovering. He was becoming a symbol, and symbols were hard to silence. When the world watches, the smallest step becomes a verdict. The air inside the conference hall was stiff with quiet anticipation, cold fluorescent lights casting pale reflections off the polished table at the center. No windows, no distractions, just the sterile sterility of corporate justice about to be served. Darren Krell sat near the end of the table, shoulders drawn tight, lips pressed into a thin line. His skin had lost its usual defiant flush. Now it was pale, almost ashen. Gone was the arrogant tilt of his chin, replaced by a nervous stillness. Broncade entered moments later, sharply dressed in a dark navy suit that barely creased as he sat. He scanned the room with the calculating eyes of a man who believed he still had control. He gave a faint nod to the board members, then glanced at Darren, just once and without warmth. Whatever alliance they once shared was now a liability. Then came Cyrus Ellen. He stepped into the room without an announcement, without a security escort, without a single note of hesitation. He wore a charcoal suit, simple but tailored, and in his hand was a black folder so slim it seemed almost harmless. But those who had followed the case, those who had seen the headlines, watched the footage, heard the echo of Milo's name, knew that folder held weight greater than any suitcase. He did not speak as he moved to the seat directly across from Braun. The two men didn't greet each other. No handshakes, no fake smiles. Only a locked glance, one of veiled resolve from Cyrus, and one of tightly controlled contempt from Braun. The chairman, a quiet man named Delric Soren, cleared his throat and began. Today's hearing will address the incident recorded at Gate 47B. The panel will review the evidence and determine administrative accountability and sanctions under the Aviation Conduct Charter. The lights dimmed. A screen descended behind the panel. Cyrus didn't flinch. Video footage began to roll. The hum of the terminal. The gate door. The smirk. There was no music, no narration, just the raw footage. Darren's mocking chuckle. The metallic slam. Milo's small, sharp cry of pain. Cyrus kneeling beside his son. The silence that followed. Gasps whispered through the room. Then came the second clip, the delayed paramedics, the indifferent staff, the quick swipe of Darren's hand across the screen used to file the report. The moment his smirk returned when Cyrus asked for medical support. Braun tapped his pen. "We've already established that Mr. Krell's actions were unfortunate but unintentional," he said, voice smooth. "There's no proof that his conduct—" "Play the next file," Cyrus said softly. Delric nodded. A time-stamped video opened. An internal email, sent 4 minutes after the incident. Braun's signature stamped across the screen. The subject line read, "Incident flagged as mechanical error. No fault assigned. Archive secondary footage." The silence that followed was heavy. Braun shifted. "That email was part of protocol." "And the deletion request," Cyrus interrupted. He opened his folder for the first time. "May I present Clause 18D of the Internal Surveillance Integrity Mandate." He laid a printed document before the board. Attached is a voice recording, anonymous but legally certified, of Mr. Torrin Vale, Assistant Systems Technician. Delric signaled to continue. The audio played. A man's voice, nervous and breathless, came through the speakers. "He told me to wipe the backups, said no one would ask, that the door just slipped. But I saw it. I saw the way he did it." Braun's jaw tightened. More whispers stirred among the panelists. "That recording," Cyrus said quietly, "was sent directly to the Lumeris Ethics Division. We verified metadata. It matches the server log times, just before the backup wipe occurred. You can cross-reference it with your own logs." Braun stood. "This is absurd. You're taking the word of a junior tech who worked under you," Cyrus finished for him, "who had access only because you granted it, who you then transferred to Cargo Division 2 days after the footage went missing." The boardroom grew still. Darren sank lower in his chair, head down. Even he understood now. Whatever protection he thought he had, it had just vanished under the light of truth. Delric adjusted his glasses, voice steady. "This board has heard sufficient evidence. We'll now enter deliberation. No need," another board member said, tapping the documents before him. "The chain of accountability is clear." Within minutes, the decision came. Darren Krell. Immediate termination. Lifetime disqualification from any airline employment. Braun Cade. Stripped of senior operations credentials. Barred from managerial roles in passenger services. Referred for a formal ethics investigation. Cyrus didn't react with a smile. He didn't gloat. He simply stood and gathered his folder. He turned once more to Darren, who looked up only when he sensed movement. Cyrus's voice was calm, deliberate. Doors only hide truth when people are afraid to open them. The door opened with a soft mechanical hiss, and Milo pushed it forward without hesitation. The therapist beside him paused, surprised by the boy's sudden confidence. "You sure you're ready for that?" he asked gently. But Milo, his arm still wrapped in a light support bandage, nodded once. "It doesn't scare me anymore," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Behind the glass partition, Cyrus stood with his arms folded, watching. A flicker of emotion crossed his face, relief wrapped in quiet pride. He had been to dozens of meetings, heard 100 public statements since the ruling, but nothing compared to this moment. This was recovery. This was resilience. Later that evening, Cyrus sat in his study, the soft light of a desk lamp casting long shadows across folders stacked like silent witnesses. He had begun to catalog every document tied to Darren and Bron, thinking perhaps the storm had passed. That was when the message came. A private email, marked urgent. The sender, Lauren Doss, a journalist whose past work had helped topple an executive chain of negligence in a separate scandal. Cyrus opened it cautiously. The message was short. The pattern is bigger. Bron forged more than one report. Passengers silenced. Documents buried. Are you ready to go deeper? For a long moment he didn't respond. He looked at Milo's framed hospital bracelet on the shelf, a reminder of what had already been endured. Then he typed back, "Meet me." No press, just the truth. 2 nights later, the city's skyline flickered under winter clouds as Cyrus waited in a dim cafe near the terminal. Lauren arrived precisely on time, carrying a leather satchel and eyes sharp with caution. "I've seen sealed documents," he began, unfolding 3 faded reports. "This one is from a 2019 case, passenger shoulder injury. Claimed it was turbulence. But look at this." He pointed to the timestamp. Flight hadn't even taken off yet. Cyrus narrowed his eyes. Bron authorized this? Stamped and signed. And not just this one. 3 others, different airports. Same pattern, injury, silence, settlement, disappearance from the logs. "Why would they do that?" Cyrus asked, leaning in. Lauren's voice lowered. "Because it's cheaper to settle quietly than to retrain staff or admit fault." Bron was protecting the brand, not the people. The weight of those words settled between them. Cyrus looked out the window, his reflection overlaid on the glowing terminal beyond. "This door," he said, "it was never just about my son. It was about how easily silence is installed in place of responsibility." He stood abruptly, his decision firming. "Send me everything you have. If they've buried others, we'll exhume every name." The next morning, Cyrus walked the terminal alone. Gate 47B gleamed under newly installed lighting. The area had been repainted, made sterile, almost innocent. But to him, it was the ground zero of something deeper. He stood near the door, brushing his fingers across its smooth edge, and replayed the sound it made when it struck Milo. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. Behind him, a janitor wheeled his cart, paused, and recognized him. "You're the one who made them change the rules, aren't you?" he asked. Cyrus didn't answer. He simply looked at the man and gave a quiet nod. That night in his office, he reopened the files. One report in particular caught his attention, dated 4 years ago, with the name Nathan Cray. The injury details were nearly identical to Milo's, but the report ended in settlement. No footage, no follow-up. Just a signature. B. Cade. He reached for the phone. "Lauren, I need everything on Nathan Cray. I want to know where he is now." Lauren paused on the other end. "You think he'll talk?" "I think," Cyrus said slowly, "he's been waiting for someone to ask." The days that followed were a blur of coordination. His team at Lumeris Compliance Division began a quiet probe into Braun's record. Every authorization log, every erased incident report, every inexplicable transfer of funds was documented and compared. Patterns emerged like cracks in an old painting, hidden but undeniable. Meanwhile, Milo's recovery continued. He moved more confidently, laughed more often. One morning during therapy, he opened a door, turned to the instructor, and said with a smirk, "Easy." When Cyrus saw the footage of that moment, he didn't smile. He stared in silence, heart full but mind burdened. The past was healing, but the future still waited. A week later, Cyrus returned to the terminal after hours. Security let him through quietly. The gates were closed, the hall quiet. He walked to Gate 47B and stood there, alone under the muted ceiling lights. The door shimmered under the overhead glow, looking as harmless as any other. He placed his hand on the frame, then closed his eyes. The hallway was silent. No crowds, no announcements, only memory. Some doors don't just open to planes, he thought. They open to truth waiting too long in silence. Cyrus stepped through the security checkpoint of the National Aviation Ethics Council building, his shoes echoing across the polished marble floor. No media swarm, no security escort, just a man and his principals, walking into a chamber where silence held more power than any podium. The hearings had begun with little fanfare, but tension hovered like static in the air. Months of investigation had led to this moment. Testimonies had been gathered, whistleblowers protected, and a thick stack of documents now sat on the mahogany bench before the council members. Inside the chamber, rows of press observers sat behind the glass barrier. They were forbidden to speak, but their pens scratched rapidly against notebooks. The council, a panel of 7 men in formal suits, looked down from a raised semicircular desk, each with a nameplate and a copy of the final report, The Laugh That Exposed a System, authored by journalist Lauren Doss. The title was no longer just a headline. It had become the spear point of a national conversation. Cyrus was sworn in under oath. He wore a navy blue suit, his tie slightly loosened. The air was cool, sterile, clinical, but his words, when he spoke, carried warmth tempered with iron. "We were at Gate 47B, he began plainly. My son, 12 years old, was struck by the gate door. Deliberately. And the laughter that followed wasn't just callous, it was systemic." The panel leaned forward. One of them, Counselor Marin Voss, adjusted his glasses. "Dr. Ellen, you've submitted over 30 documents and visual exhibits. But today we ask you to speak not as a CEO, but as a father," Cyrus finished gently. "I understand." From the gallery, Milo watched. His arm was no longer in a sling, but a faint line of bruising peeked from beneath his rolled cuff. He sat upright, determined, flanked by a legal observer and one of Cyrus's aides. He had insisted on attending. He wanted to see what truth looked like when it was spoken without fear. A large screen behind Cyrus flickered to life. Frame by frame the footage played, the sound of Darren's laugh, the mechanical groan of the gate hinge, the soft cry from Milo as he stumbled back. Every image, magnified and slowed, added weight to the room. Not one council member looked away. Then came the secondary clip, security logs with altered timestamps. "Braun Cade," Cyrus said, pointing at a line of text, "approved the falsified report within 4 minutes of the incident." That's not investigation. That's protection. Gasps weren't allowed, but the council members shifted visibly. One, Councillor Romar, clenched his pen so tightly it snapped audibly. Papers rustled. The next exhibit was a sworn statement from a technician named Torrin Vale, a quiet man who had risked his job to testify that he had been ordered to delete footage and override the event flag in the surveillance archive. "He didn't just follow orders," Cyrus said, steady as stone. "He followed fear." But that doesn't excuse the structure built to allow fear to thrive. Counselor Marin cleared his throat. "Dr. Ellen, what do you believe this council must do?" Cyrus didn't look at the camera or the panel. He looked at Milo. "Create mandatory behavioral audits. Make real-time injury transparency a rule, not a request. Protect those who record truth when authority tries to erase it. Do not let another child sit behind a closed door, wondering why someone laughed after hurting them." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The stillness that followed was louder than any applause. Outside, journalists prepared their headlines. Inside, the council recessed for deliberation. Cyrus remained seated. He didn't pace or check his watch. He simply folded his hands and waited, eyes never leaving the floor. This wasn't about winning. This was about preventing recurrence. 20 minutes later, the council returned. The lead chair stood. "The council unanimously rules in favor of sweeping structural reform within all aviation terminals under federal partnership. Effective immediately. Behavioral audits every quarter. Digital flagging of all passenger injuries with real-time oversight. And, most importantly, any video or audio captured by passengers or guardians shall be considered legally protected evidence under the Public Safety Clause." No cheers followed. Just silence and something heavier than victory. Consequence. Darren Krell and Bron Cade's names were formally entered into the Ethics Violation Registry. They were barred from employment in any passenger-facing aviation role for life. Their photos would be printed in every future employee training handbook under a section titled Ethics in Practice, What Must Never Repeat. As Cyrus exited the hall, Milo joined him, their steps slow and parallel. They didn't speak right away. They didn't need to. At the elevator, Milo finally asked, "Are you glad it's over?" Cyrus gave a faint smile. "It's not over. But it's begun." He glanced toward the city skyline beyond the tall windows, where planes crossed the horizon like silver lines of destiny. He didn't wave to the reporters waiting at the curb. He didn't agree to any interviews. When one of them called out, "Dr. Ellen, will you speak for the cameras?" He only responded with a question of his own. "Will you keep watching when no one's hurt?" That night, Lauren Doss published the full inquiry. The title, bold and unflinching, spread across media platforms with relentless traction. The subtitle said it all. Years of negligence, hidden in plain sight, until one father opened the door. In schools, ethics programs began referencing the case. Training seminars opened with the clip of Gate 47B, not for the drama, but for the silence that followed. A silence that had finally been broken by reason, not rage. Cyrus stayed out of the spotlight. He declined documentaries, podcasts, profiles. The story didn't belong to him. It belonged to every passenger who had ever been ignored. In an internal memo to his team at Lumeris Dynamics, he wrote only one line under the company's values section. "When justice walks slowly, it leaves footprints others can follow." The gate slid open with a faint hiss, and the crowd surged forward as cameras clicked in rapid bursts. Sunlight pooled on the polished tiles of Terminal C, newly renovated, freshly inaugurated, and gleaming with intention. The ceremony had just concluded, but for Dr. Cyrus Ellen, this wasn't a celebration. It was a reckoning marked by silence, memory, and quiet reform. He stood near the edge of the crowd, far from the podium where the airline's new director, Nolan Frey, had just spoken words of gratitude. Milo, now taller and more self-assured, stood at his side, wearing a gray jacket almost identical to his father's. He looked up at the gate marker above them, 47B, where it all began. A sleek metal plaque had been mounted just beside the boarding tunnel. Its brushed surface caught the morning light, and in block lettering it read, "Respect is the first boarding pass." A simple line, but to Cyrus it was everything. He kept his arms folded behind his back, his posture straight, eyes steady on the plaque. It hadn't been his idea. The board had insisted on commemorating the change. But now that it was here, it felt less like vanity and more like closure, an acknowledgement that pain, when faced with truth, could be transformed. "Dr. Ellen," came a voice from behind. He turned to see Director Frey approaching with a warm but careful expression. "I wanted to thank you again," Frey said, extending a hand. "This terminal, this policy overhaul, it wouldn't exist without your stand." Cyrus shook his hand with calm composure, nodding once. "It wasn't a stand," he replied. "It was a correction." Frey's smile faltered, but not out of offense, out of understanding. He excused himself to greet a delegation of Aviation Council members as more executives arrived for photos and press coverage. Milo stepped closer, his voice low. "It looks different now." Cyrus glanced at the gate. "It should." "No one laughed today," Milo said. He tried to sound casual, but Cyrus caught the tension in his shoulders. The boy hadn't forgotten what happened, not entirely. Trauma doesn't vanish. It softens into memory. "There's nothing funny about dignity," Cyrus said, his voice quiet but firm. Then he turned and began walking along the corridor, hands clasped behind him. Milo followed. As they moved past the new security desk and updated signage, employees subtly turned to look at them. Some nodded with silent gratitude, others with polite formality. No one interrupted. Cyrus didn't need recognition. What mattered had already been changed. A news reporter lingered at the far edge of the space, trying to catch his attention, microphone in hand. He ignored it. He hadn't come for interviews. He came to see if the lesson endured. They stopped before the gate one final time. Milo glanced around and asked, "Did we win?" Cyrus looked at him for a long moment. His eyes, often unreadable in meetings and courtrooms, now held warmth, a trace of softness only Milo ever fully saw. He placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder. "We didn't win," he said, voice clear and measured. "We corrected the course." The weight of the past year didn't vanish in that moment, but it settled. The crowd had faded behind them. The new terminal buzzed with renewed order, and as the automatic gate opened for its first official boarding, a beam of light crossed the freshly waxed floor. Cyrus turned toward it, shoulders squared, gaze steady. No one should ever be shut out of dignity again. She shut out compassion and watched justice walk back through the same door. If you believe every wrong deserves its reckoning, subscribe now, because dignity always finds its way in. The story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, arrogance, and the consequences of cruelty when faced with integrity and justice. Its purpose is to raise awareness, promote empathy, and inspire conversations about equality, accountability, and the power of standing up for what's right.